Welcome to RS 105, World Religions, here at Cal Poly Humboldt. Now, there are a great many ways to organize a class like this, and I've seen a lot of different versions go really well. No matter how you do it, though, it's tricky. All of human history throughout time, it's a lot to cover in one class, and there's just no getting around the fact that things are going to be left out. We'll do our best. Here's the lay of the land. There are 7 units, or modules. I'll use those words interchangeably. In the first unit, we'll introduce the field and some of its most important vocabulary, and we'll also talk about some indigenous traditions that have been harmed by and have pressed back against traditional Western assumptions about religion, about what it is and how to recognize it. Then, for the remaining units, we'll take one tradition at a time and do what we can to familiarize ourselves with it. We'll go in this order: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and finally, the traditions of China, especially Taoism and Confucianism. This will bring us full circle in some ways back to this first unit, in that these traditions can be understood as Chinese indigenous traditions, and in that it's often said of them, as it has been of the traditions indigenous to the Americas, that they're not really religions. So we'll get to ask ourselves once more what it means to be really a religion. Before we start moving, though, we'll take a look at where we're beginning from. And I'll introduce the stance of the religious studies scholar, or another way to put the same thing, the methodology that is used within the field of religious studies to ensure that we, as students and as scholars, approach the information available to us in a way that will allow us to understand and appreciate people who are different from us. You might wonder, why do we need to develop a particular stance to do this well? You might think, I know plenty of people who are different from me. I've been fully able in my own life and my own relationships to understand and appreciate them without needing a lot of academic words to explain myself, explain why or how I'm doing that. And it's true that most of us do engage diversity in real ways in our own lives on a personal level, and without taking a step back to consider and thoughtfully improve the way we might think about or speak of or communicate with those people whose experiences or sense of value we don't share. But the need for the clear methodology in the field of religious studies is a real one. History has shown us, and contemporary politics continues to show us, that there are significant dangers in approaching diverse communities without being self-aware of our own position, our own stance, our own approach. Religious studies is a relatively new field. Folks around the globe have long studied religion, but they've most often done so as adherents to one or another worldview. And this has meant that when scholars have seen individuals and communities who adhere to worldviews different from their own, they've looked at and they've sought to understand those individuals and communities in terms of their own, the scholar's own, worldviews. Now, a classically unfortunate example of this can be found in a well-known chapter of U.S. history when Christians approaching native populations looked at those populations through a Christian lens, so that manifestations of the sacred were seen as demons. Those who practiced shamanic engagement with these sacred forces were seen as possessed or as witches, and the most generous response that these colonizing Christians could muster within themselves was the attempt to convert. Now, this example, and we'll dig deeper into it later in the unit, it makes it plain to us that the potentially devastating social and political effects of seeing others through the lens of our own worldview. And many of us might feel that we can dismiss this example as irrelevant to our own lives. We're past that, we think. We no longer deride or demonize populations who practice spiritual traditions that are different from our own. And we have made progress. But the examples don't need to be so stark. When Western students look to Buddhism, it's often easy for them to see the Buddhist goal of nirvana as a kind of not quite Christian salvation, or to see karma as a mechanism through which cosmic punishment is doled out. When looking at the Hebrew Bible, Christians often see the role of sin and Jesus as prevalent in the stories it tells. Contemporary Americans have found it easy to look at veiling practices, especially in Islam, through a feminist lens, seeing all women wearing the hijab as woefully oppressed by a patriarchal society. None of these perspectives approach the tradition being observed through the lens of that tradition. Now, fundamental to understanding others is accepting that not everyone lives by our categories of value. Not everyone sees meaning in what is meaningful to us. Meaning isn't given, it's made. The world presents itself to us and we interpret it as meaningful in one way or another way that makes sense to us. But it's not all about us. And learning to practice the stance we'll call phenomenology is learning to see our world in a way that really realizes that. Now, the promise of this course is twofold. If you engage with the resources provided to you in this course and you participate in the activities assigned to you, you'll leave the course with both a greater religious literacy and also an increased self-awareness with respect to your own sense of meaning and value, of truth and beauty. Now, I believe pretty strongly that reaching these two goals will lead each of you to being better citizens in a diverse global world and will also enrich your life. So to finish today, we'll talk a little bit about the methodology or the stance that will prepare us to move, smoothly through the field of religious studies, to see the truth and beauty, success and failure, life and death in new ways. Now, as we turn to specific traditions, we'll attend to those traditions' doctrinal elements, or what those traditions say about the rules for being human, the facts of the cosmos, the creeds and the catechisms, the pillars and the commandments, and the noble truths. And we'll look at the narrative aspects of those traditions. They're stories of creation and end times, of gods battling, striking deals, offering gifts of grace, of the cosmos and its relationship to individuals and to communities. We'll attend to how traditions approach celebration, the environment, gender, politics, food, family, and other aspects of human experience. And in looking at these things, we'll work to resist our mind's tendency to project our own beliefs on everyone else. We'll do this because not knowing the religions of others, their mythic foundations, their ritual engagements, it can really blindside us in important political ways. To act in this world during our brief span here in a way that manifests our own ideals, that's a life of integrity. To think about what is just and good to do and to really try to do it, that's what integrity means. And to do it well, we need to be able to see Nazism, communism, nationalism, feminism, consumerism, and other secular doctrines for what they are. These are religions in disguise in that they have throughout history taken the place of religion in people's hearts and minds. What's the work of religion? And what does that work in the life of the secular? What answers to that need? What fulfills that function? That's part of what we're looking at. The secular is increasingly a realm that religious studies attends to, in part because modern people often say that they're not religious. Many of you might consider yourself spiritual, but not religious. And what's the difference? What we generally mean when we say that, religion is a set of formalized responses to an invisible sacred reality, which has been shaped by more or less institutionalized traditions. Spirituality, on the other hand, we see as more personal, involving less of a connection to institutionalized patterns of belief and often drawing from a number of more classical religious traditions. It's all fair game here. Religion, spirituality, secular worldviews, in each of these modes, through each of these lenses, humans construct, express, challenge, and live into systems of value. So let's talk about how we can better understand those systems and how they're engaged in the world. Methodology is a fancy way of saying the study of a mode of proceeding. It's a meta-study looking at how we look at things. And in religious studies, our methodology is known as phenomenology. Now, we've got the logy at the end there, which tells us that we're looking at a system or a study, like biology is the study of life. The phenom indicates that what we're studying is what appears, what shows itself, what presents itself. Cal Poly Humboldt Professor Emeritus Bill Herbergsmeyer has written a really clear and brief explanation of phenomenology, which you have assigned to you for this unit, and we'll try to unpack it a little bit here too. An example. As RS scholars, we can say that the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, but we can't weigh in on whether through this destruction, the God of the Hebrew Bible lost his sacrificial locus, whether he was angered, whether Jesus' own death and resurrection themselves cosmically prefigured the temple's destruction. Because the very existence of the God of the Hebrew Bible, the very divinity of Jesus, these aren't facts that present themselves. They're facts of faith, and as such are not available to the scholar. Proclamations of faith do not count as evidence for the truth in the field of religious studies. They count as proclamations of faith. Now, this is a good time for me to make clear that it's not my goal in this course, it's not the goal of religious studies to make you either more or less religious. To say that proclamations of faith don't count as evidence for the truth is not to say that they're not true. They may be, but they're true as all spiritual matters are true. They're true for the believer, and their truth does not depend upon, and it's not answerable to, the observable facts of our shared experience. Spiritual or metaphysical truths are self-authenticating to those to whom they are true. Now, I might know it to be true that my love for my children will outlive me, that my hopes and prayers for their well-being have an effect, a real effect on their experience of the world. And that's not a truth you can talk me out of, because there's no evidence in this world that can convince me that my love for my children has anything less than cosmic significance. On the other hand, though, there's no evidence in this world that can prove the cosmic significance of my love to a non-believer, and it's characteristic of spiritual truths that they need no such evidence. Or, to put it another way, it's characteristic of spiritual truths that all of experience stands as evidence for their truth. Now, if you're asked, as a religious studies scholar, to understand something about my experience and the experience of my community, you're going to have a more complete and vibrant picture if you work to understand how my worldview is characterized, how it's embodied in social and political relations, how it's expressed through ritual, art, daily habit. To do this well, you'll need to sort of set aside or bracket your own worldview when you look at me and my world, so that your worldview doesn't get in the way of your seeing life through my eyes. If you believe, for instance, that after death, the human becomes compost and nothing more, you might be inclined to see my cosmic and death-defying vision of maternal love as sort of foolish. The social and political relationships that my community has built around this worldview, they might correspondingly strike you as sort of childlike or blind to reality, a pageant of wishful thinking. And you might be right. But you will never understand me or my community if you plainly know that you're right going in, if you can't set aside your worldview long enough to see mine as I see it. And that might matter, say, if my village of eternal personal love is engaged in trade or warfare or projects of education or environmental recuperation with your village of imminently compostable rationalists. And at the end of the day, neither one of us can prove the ultimate reality of our worldview. We can only work to live with integrity into it, and to approach different worldviews with both generosity and justice. Now, my example is an easy one to approach. Things will get trickier when we look at Hindu-Buddhist relations, or Christian-Muslim relations, or Catholic-Protestant relations, or Evangelical-Mormon relations. Let's be honest about that and prepare ourselves to face the challenges that lie ahead. Pause the video for a minute here, if you like, and think about what challenges you might face in adopting this stance. Take for your examples the difficult ones. Whatever your worldview, consider a worldview you think is farthest from it, even conflicting with it. In what ways might it be difficult for you to approach difference across those faith lines? I've come up with my own list, which is by no means exhaustive, and some parts of which I'm guessing you've thought about. But here's the first. Standing outside of our own commitments can be difficult, especially when we're part of a community that shares our commitments. It can be scary to bracket off our deepest truths if, along with the Buddhists, I know to the core of my being that life is fraught with suffering and that suffering is born of attachment. How will I understand Jews, attached as they are to tradition and ritual and God and family? Can I approach their tradition without reading everything through my own lens, without seeing all of their suffering as rooted in their religious attachment to a God who is, in my Buddhist view, false? It's a real challenge, and it's one that requires us to take stock honestly and carefully of our own responses. But it's a challenge we can face, as is the challenge of getting beyond our own assumptions. All Catholics like to suffer, or all Hindus worship cows, or everyone wearing a turban is a Muslim. This latter assumption led to a number of killings, where angry, ignorant Americans shot Sikhs in the weeks following the 9/11 attacks, thinking they were Muslims. They're not. Or all Buddhists are compassionate and meditatively calm. Generalizations just don't work in the world of religious studies, but getting at the wild diversity of human spiritual experience can also be intimidating. There's a lot of information out there, and everyone understands their worldview in their own way. Ask 100 Baptists what religion means, and you're likely to get 100 different answers. But we have to remember that just because we cannot know everything doesn't mean that we cannot understand anything. Pragmatism will be one of our motivating measures here. There are trends, and we can identify and evaluate them. More than anything else, it's our openness to the worldviews of others that will equip us to remain flexible in the face of an ever-growing, always changing set of information. And again, as we do that, we'll want to keep our own categories, our own assumptions about what's valuable in check. We're not going to understand a Taoist if we approach them from within our own intellectual, syncretic, New Age positions, say, and through that lens. We're not going to understand a Christian if we approach them from within our own Muslim position and through that lens. Now, the counterpoint to this awareness of diversity is an awareness of the shared human experience. We do have things in common. And while I don't happen to agree with scholar Huston Smith that all religions are paths up the same mountain, I also know that we're all born and die on this planet, and that much of our experience while we're here is defined by our biology. We share experiences of love and devotion and anger and indignation and hope. Maintaining our awareness of this can help us to see others generously. But we won't always be able to be generous. I can't see acts of human oppression generously, even when those acts are motivated by religious fervor. There are lines that each of us draws. But multiple, consensual adult marriage, hey, I might not agree with it, but it's been practiced, and we will work to approach practices that we don't agree with as generous and just scholars. And there'll be a lot of examples. Holding that stance will often mean recognizing that not all people are religious studies scholars. Religion isn't something that people generally bracket off, and a culture that's truly pluralistic accepts multiple expressions of religion in the public sphere. Freedom of religion doesn't mean freedom from religion in the public sphere. In the best of worlds, it does involve an understanding of the diverse religious expressions that are present in that public secular sphere. So to recap, this semester we will be approaching religious traditions from around the world, and we will do so using the phenomenological stance. In doing this, we will increase our religious literacy, preparing ourselves to be better citizens, and we will also enrich our own sense of self-awareness with respect to our own worldviews. By the end of the course, we'll all know more about spiritual traditions that are not our own, and we'll also know more about what we believe. We'll be firmer in our own sense of what the big questions are and how we might answer them through our words and through our deeds, in our individual reveries, and in our relationships with one another. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Next time, we'll look at some foundational figures in the field of religious studies, and we'll see the ways that their contributions have helped to shape our project here. Until then.